Welcome back to A Conversation About. Today we are joined by a fellow Longhorn, Thadd Patterson. We're going to be talking about Attack on Titan, which happens to be one of my favorite animes, and I know Thad has a lot of commentary on it. I have a lot of commentary on it too. But first, I'd like to get your initial thoughts and your initial opinions about it.
I think it's good. I think it's creative in its storytelling. I think one of the things we were going to talk about is the final season has this shift, and it's there's something about like the final season and what it's doing that I think is really interesting in terms of like storytelling. That are not a lot of stories really do this, or the ones that do are like pretty widely praised.
Yeah, I started watching it maybe about 2 years ago. I think I was a little late to it. It had already been running for a while.
Mhm.
Um, so I was very grateful that I could watch the first two
Oh
seasons
yeah.
immediately because it was so good. But I think you're right. Like the fourth season was just like a completely different, maybe shift in paradigm. In the narrative, like the storyline is there, but like you can tell there was a completely different shift. I agree.
Yeah, so the way I like to describe it is like in a lot of other stories we'll get introduced to like our main character, who's usually the hero character, the protagonist, and then if there's a bad guy, we get introduced to the bad guy, and sometimes the bad guy has like a backstory, right? And it's like
Mhm.
we don't know what their backstory is, but part of good storytelling is like giving a backstory to a villain that is sympathetic, that you kind of almost understand. And that's not to like make you, it's not to justify the villain's actions ever, but it just, you feel things more efficiently when you identify with a villain, at least some ways. And so Attack on Titan is just Aaron's villain origin story, and you don't realize it until the
Yeah.
final season. Like you're not supposed to know. And so you spend this whole show you rooting for this guy who's like trapped in these walls, who's dealing with all this like tragedy and trauma and like terrifying ordeals. And you're like, oh, he's gonna, see it through to the end. He's gonna accomplish his goal, protect his friends, eliminate the Titans or whatever. And then we get to the final season, and it's like, wait, you pump the brakes a little bit, bro. Like
Yeah.
you're kind of you're taking it a little too far.
Yeah,
And I
0 to 100 real quick.
and I think that's the thing. Like it's supposed to be a story that it like breaks him. Like he's not the good guy, and everyone kind of points it out to him in the final season. They're like,
Mhm.
hey dude, like you didn't have to do this.
Yeah.
Like when I think, I don't remember if it was Armin or Mikasa, but she's like, that there were like kids there and like
Yeah.
innocent people, and he was like, he's like, this is all that can be done or whatever. And it's like, oh, you're the bad guy.
Yeah.
And one of the really cool storytelling things that it does, I think, is a it gives us an Aaron part two with Gabby, because she looks just like him, and her startup is like the same as his. And so when it does this perspective shift, like into the final season, when we have Gabby, who's just like a little Aaron,
Mhm.
and then Aaron shows up and terrorizes her hometown and kills her friends, it's like, oh, I've been here before, right? Like when this happened to Aaron, I thought, oh, the other people are the bad people. And so now the show's wanting me to think, oh, Aaron's the bad guy. And I think that's really interesting. I don't think a lot of stories are told that way, where it's like, 2/3 of the way through, it's like, oh, the main character is actually the villain of this story.
I agree. I don't know many stories that do that. Like, because you're right, we were like rooting for Aaron the whole time, and then at the end or at this final season, it's like, wait a minute, like he's doing very villainous things, and it's at first when it panned over. Spoiler alert for everybody out there. I probably should have said that at first, right? But at least for this part of the fourth season, Like I still almost did see I guess it was the Marleyans as still being the wait, is it the Marleyans are the people of Paradise Island, right? Or is it no, it's the Eldians, right?
Yeah, the Eldians are on the island.
Yeah, yeah.
The Marleyans are the ones
Marleyans
that.
are, yeah, right. So I still saw the Marleyans as kind of the villains,
Yeah,
but because we were like for the longest our protagonists were the people on Paradise Island, right?
mhm.
um and it was really interesting to see at first that hatred that Gabby had, that was like this almost the same hatred that Aaron had. And
Yeah,
right, like the similarities are definitely there. And like one of the things that immediately jumped out at me was as soon as they were like trying to grasp and comprehend the topic or the conflict that they were having, where Gabby was like, well, my people didn't do anything, and then
mhm.
here comes Aaron and completely attacks us for something that my people didn't necessarily do. And then Aaron is basically in the same predicaments in the first couple of seasons, where like we didn't do anything to deserve this, and here we are getting attacked by titans, by people from another continent, it turns out. And it
Yeah,
took me a second to like really think about that. I still don't really have my mind made up or like completely know how I feel about that whole, like they're both in the same, I mean it's two sides of the same coin, they're both in the same predicament.
yeah. I think one thing that just came to mind is like the only other story that I'm really super familiar with that would do something like this is if you were to watch the Star Wars movies in numbered order, where you start with episode. I don't know how familiar you are with Star Wars.
Not very much.
So okay, so the first trilogy that came out was episodes 4, 5, and 6,
Mhm.
and in episodes 4, 5, and 6, Darth Vader's the bad guy pretty much.
Mhm.
But you find out that he has ties to the main character Luke,
Yeah.
and then there's like a sort of forgiveness scene at the end because Darth Vader was the bad guy the whole time. But um, then after that came out, they released episodes 1, 2, and 3 as like the prequel trilogy. So they
Mhm.
made these movies well after the fact, but it was intended to tell the story of Darth Vader. But if you
Gotcha.
had no idea anything about Star Wars and you just watched from episode 1 to 2 to 3, episode 3, Darth Vader becomes the bad guy, and then you have 4, 5, and 6 where he's the bad guy, and then at episode 6 he gets his like redemption. But so you brought up something that I think is pretty interesting with Attack on Titan, and it's that we see people like doing bad things as a result of like socialization. Like Aaron's doing bad things to innocent people now, and those innocent people also are convinced that they're better than the Eldians anyways. Like the Marleyans are they all are they're just racist is the
Yeah.
the problem. But they're they're racist because in the past the Eldians like or the descendants of Ymir or whatever, the Eldians I like harmed them, right? So there's this feeling of like, y'all did that to us in the past, and so now y'all deserve this retribution or whatever. But you get a generation removed from that, and now you're persecuting people who didn't have anything to do with the stuff that
Yeah.
happened, right? And so but I think the show comes under a lot of criticism for that, and that's one of the things that I don't necessarily agree with that criticism, because the show very clearly and almost heavy-handedly uses like sort of World War II imagery, right? And like
Yeah.
things to invoke those like feelings, but I don't think it's doing that to frame either side of anything as good or bad. Like I think Aaron's supposed to be the bad guy in the story, but I think it's mainly a story about like, war and racism and how those things pervade through like generations and through societies. And I don't think it's trying to be like, oh, these are the bad guys and these are the good guys. Like it's not. It's a very complicated story, and it's meant to be. And I think that's what's cool about it. But I feel like people see, sort of representations of maybe like Nazi Germany or the United States with internment camps, and they're like, oh, these, these are like they'll see that. And I mean, there's been articles written about this, that it's like a pro like fascist pro Nazi anime, and I'm like, I don't even think so. I think it just is
Yeah.
using the imagery to make you think something. Like it makes you think, oh, the Marleyans are bad people, right? And it makes you think that, and it wants you to think that, because for all we know, they are. But then we get this perspective shift, and it's like, oh, there's like innocent Marleyan children that are,
Yeah.
getting slaughtered as a result of this war and this like back and forth that's happening. And so now you feel conflicted because you're like, oh, these people I thought were bad people the whole time, some of them aren't bad, but now they're being killed by the people I thought were good people this whole time, and those people are. It's a very complicated story. I think it's really cool for that.
So to build off of that, like as soon as you started saying that, because I mean, sometimes it's really difficult to talk about like who's in the wrong, especially like because there's a lot of you can overlap a lot of like the topics that were talked about in the show to like modern day life, and even like a couple years back, like you mentioned, like Nazi Germany, and I mean it's very reminiscent of that with the armbands and stuff, and like like you said, internment camps in the United States and stuff. Um, One of the things that popped into my head is those things are sometimes difficult to talk about.
Mhm.
It's because they're in the real world. And like we sometimes we're like forced to do some kind of binary, this good, that bad, this bad person, this good person,
Mhm.
this bad people, this good people. Um, what I think is interesting about this show, and like I mean, I don't necessarily think that commentary about it being like a pro-fascist kind of ideology. I don't necessarily follow that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's interesting to be able to talk about these topics within the show, because then we don't have to argue about real people. We can argue about fictional characters and stuff and still actually get to talk about this topic. And like because of how difficult it is to talk about this topic, um, I mean, in our own history, like both sides of whatever group you can think of have done bad things.
Mhm.
And it's difficult to say, it's difficult sometimes to admit, okay, you know what? Like you've been doing bad things to us, but we also did some pretty messed up things. So let's just find a way to go to come together and make peace. Sometimes that's a difficult real life conversation, but seeing this topic explored in the show kind of eases us into the topic and gets us kind of, it puts that mentality in our psyche, so then we can like use that as a reflection. I mean, I don't know how much people like actually do this, but like
Yeah.
maybe use the show later on, like, oh well, now that we're talking about this, I remember back when I watched so and so show that like this was also kind of talked about.
Yeah. I think one of the things that the show gets criticism for is that it presents like, it gives us this imagery of like, oh, there's, maybe like a group of people that could be mapped on to like the Nazis in Germany, and there's a group of people that you could map on to the Jewish people being, like murdered and, oppressed. And then it takes those. So like if we're going to run with that analogy, then the Eldians would probably are the people being uh slaughtered pretty much, and those they would map on to Jewish people in World War II. And then we get Aaron turning into a bad guy, right? And so now that, there's criticism of like, is that a responsible way to tell that story, where it's like, you're almost, I don't believe this is the case, but there's criticism that's like you're justifying what the Marleyans thought when Aaron turns into the bad guy. You're like, oh, maybe they were right to try and, kill them all and keep those people locked on the island or whatever. But I really think and I mean, there's some fair criticism there, but I think mainly the story is just very like anti-war, anti-racism, anti-xenophobia, anti, like, I mean, even like classism. Like there's a lot of stuff because we have the military elite sitting in the middle of the city while the people on the outside are forced to deal with the Titans and like starve or whatever. And I think it uses imagery to invoke certain feelings, but not to like push a moral of the story that, maybe they, and this is the criticism, but people are like, it's pushing this story that like maybe the Nazis were right, because if they didn't keep the Jews oppressed, the Jews were going to rise up and kill everyone or something like that. But I don't think that's the case with the show. I think, when you watch the show, it's very like anti-war, anti-fascism, anti-racism. And I think that's what's really cool about it. And I mean, using imagery from, sort of sensitive topics isn't a new thing. I mean,
Yeah.
I think you can do it responsibly and you can probably do it irresponsibly. And I think Attack on Titan, there's criticisms of the way it uses imagery, but I think the main thing it does is it just invokes certain feelings. Like one thing is, I talked to a friend about this. Probably one of the most famous examples of this is Star Wars. Star Wars very clearly, its bad guys, the Empire, are supposed to allude to like Nazi Germany, just like
Okay.
100%. And like the creator has talked about this, like George Lucas, like they're the bad guys. You see them and you think, oh, those are the Nazis, pretty much. And so when you're watching it, you just what function does that serve? It just makes you think, oh, these are the bad guys. They're not gonna walk on the screen and there's going to be a subtitle that's like, these are the bad guys. Like you're going to see them and you're going to hear this like booming, like marching music. The song's called the Imperial March when Darth Vader shows up for the first time, and he's dressed in all black and his helmet looks like the Nazi helmets, and these stormtroopers and they're standing in line. So as soon as they show up, you're like, oh, these are the bad guys, right? And that's what the imagery is there for, is to make you think, oh, these are the bad guys. This is like the oppressive, like fascist sort of regime. And then at the end of it, we get Darth Vader is essentially like forgiven by Luke for the stuff that he's done. I mean, he like murdered millions of people. Like he's not a good guy by any means. Like, but Luke forgives him because Darth Vader saves him at one point. And so there's this, bonding moment between the two of them. But then Darth Vader dies and is like as a punishment for his, wrongdoings. But I don't think the moral of that story is, oh, forgive the Nazis. Like that's not the story it's telling. It's not. It's using the imagery to make you feel something, but then it's telling a story outside of that. And the story that it's telling is not forgive the Nazis, but it is using like World War II imagery to invoke a feeling in you.
So kind of going to that, is Aaron the bad guy in the beginning, or like was Marley justified in perhaps expelling the Eldians into, or it wasn't necessarily expelling, but like doing the bad things because the king kind of like left on his own. But that kind of part of the narrative was a little mushy to me. But like, are they justified in doing these things to the Eldians? And then Aaron coming in as a bad guy, and it's like, okay, yeah, maybe, if you're following that process, okay, maybe like, yeah, he did become the bad guy. Maybe they were justified, but also like maybe it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like if you treat people as the bad guy and like expel them and treat them very badly, eventually they're going to rise up against you and do, I don't know, maybe bad things in efforts of revenge for what's going on.
Right. I think that's one of the core tenets of the show, is that this stuff is cyclical. And I think it's very like heavy-handed in the way that it shows that, because you have Gabby, who looks just like Aaron, undergoing the same stuff that Aaron went through, just on the other side of the conflict.
Yeah.
And I think that's like a very like in your face, like, yeah, this is a result. Like I don't think you like it, just looking at before, Aaron shows up and Marley and does the stuff that he does. I don't think there's a reason for them to continue oppressing the Eldians. Like there's just not.
Right.
They're just being racist, right? But then because they're doing that, eventually, yeah, you get this guy who, as a result of all this oppression, just kind of breaks and turns like evil pretty much. And he shows up and then does bad things. And so now, like, so okay, so you have like the Marleyans oppressing the Eldians, keeping them stuck on that island because they think, oh, the Eldians are going to do bad things. And then Aaron goes insane pretty much and then attacks the Marleyans. And so now the Marleyans are like, see, told you. And so they're going to keep it. It's like a cycle. And I think that's
Yeah,
one of the,
but
that's
it
like a big
what
point in the show is it's like,
it
the more you keep this up, it's not going to stop. We have to put a stop to it. We can't just like assume that things will calm down.
yeah, and so exactly, like if we don't put a stop to it, then like it will continue. In some ways it'll continue to go this way. If we don't put a stop to it, eventually people will break. And like, are they justified in breaking? Maybe so. If you're like, so that's like another societal topic, like how far do you push people until they break, and are they justified for breaking? Well, I mean, in some ways I would say yes, because they've been oppressed this whole time. So
Yeah.
like, I don't know if I can completely blame Aaron in the beginning, but like, I mean, obviously he goes a little too far.
Right. Yeah.
In the
Like
beginning, I don't know if I could blame him. And it's like, okay, so we have people that are breaking because they're being oppressed. So they're gonna try to do something to get revenge. It's always a lot easier to say, you know what, let's stop. And like in theory, it's always easier to tell people, okay, you know what, stop. Both of you have done bad things. Let's come together and work on it. Like we know in the real world, it doesn't necessarily work that way. So it's like, I think we can use this as an example to see how it would play out in one of the worst case scenarios where we don't stop, where we just keep, we keep this cyclical nature, where we just keep attacking each other, until obviously there's nothing left, or we go back to, like, it's so cyclical that we go back to, maybe they switch roles and the aliens are now, oppressing the Marleyans, and then like the story would just repeat again.
Yeah, I think yeah, because I think that's one of the really cool things that the story does is it kind of makes you want to identify with Aaron as he's like being the villain, because you've spent like what, 3 seasons like, oh man, we gotta get rid of these Titans. I'm on Aaron's side. Look at all this terrible stuff that's happening to him. And then you open up the final season with like just atrocities, just like just objectively he's doing terrible things, right? But you're like, but I'm kind of on his side, I think. And it's tough because it puts you in the shoes of someone who's undergone just a lifetime of terror and violence as a result of like a racially motivated war. And it makes you think like, oh yeah, I kind of get why he would do something like that. And I love that it flips you on your head like that, because it gives you Gabby, who's like dealing with the fallout of something like that. But you're also kind of like rooting for Aaron. You think like, you don't know why he's doing what he's doing necessarily, but I don't know. I think it's a really cool way to tell a story. I think it's pretty unique in that aspect. And that's one of the things that I would like recommend it to people for, is that it's a very unique story.
Yeah. And so like the first 3 seasons were conditioned, to think Aaron's a good guy because he's fighting this like undeniable evil. So like the Titans are bad because they are brainless. They don't know what they're doing, and they're like coming in and attacking the city and stuff. So like, there is a very clear villain, and like we know what we're fighting against, and we're rooting for him. I mean, to a certain extent, we're rooting for civilization. And like that, it completely flips in the 4th season, and now it's civilization against civilization. And like, I mean, that flip so late in the show, is like, just adds a whole nother dimension to it that like made a good show an even better show because of the complexities, that tag along with that. And I think, I mean, I would hate to spoil it for people. So, and then I guess I should have said at the beginning, like, if you haven't seen up to season 4, don't watch it, because there's like a very special feeling, watching Aaron develop during the 3 seasons, that it's necessary to to watch that without any kind of bias and then come into the fourth season. Because when I saw the first episode of the fourth season, I was like, okay, wait, what's going, like, it completely took me out of whack because I didn't read the manga or anything. So it was like, okay, this is completely different. Like, what is going on? And like they kind of start weaving this timeline and all these like these backstories and these narratives for these different characters. And it's like, okay, maybe these guys aren't the bad guys after all. And like now you're spending the whole season arguing with yourself, okay, but who's in the right and who's in the wrong?
It really, what you just reminded me, it really messes with you. Like one of the things is like Reiner is pretty unequivocally like the bad guy.
Yeah.
You find out he's the armored titan, you find out he does all the stuff that he does, and then he tries to flee. He tries to take Eren with him because they're trying to get back Eren's power or whatever. But
Yeah.
then we flip over to Marley in the final season, and like Reiner is just broken. He's so torn up about all the stuff that he did. And it's like, I mean, I don't think he's a good guy, but I mean, like that's even, you could even make an argument that's like anti like US imperialism. Cause like,
Yeah.
I mean, that's like a thing that, people in our military go through where they're sent over to these other countries where they're just told to do terrible things and they come back like, I did it because I was told to, and I felt like that was like they convinced me I was supposed to.
Mhm.
But oh my god, like I did terrible stuff,
Yeah.
And I think Reiner's character is very interesting in that aspect. And I mean, Reiner is he's I guess he's like the foil to Eren because we have Eren being the good guy the whole time and Reiner being the bad guy, and then we get into the final season, and Eren's doing this terrible stuff, and now Reiner's the victim of it.
Yeah.
But I mean, Eren, I'm pretty sure there's a couple times where Eren even points it out. Like
Yeah.
he's like, "Is this what it feels like, Reiner? Like, is this what it was like on that day, however many years ago?" Like he's like, "I'm doing it now. You did it to me." Like, and I think you probably make an argument that even like Reiner kind of knows like, "Oh, this is what I had coming." Like, and that's why he's so ripped up about it because he developed those relationships with those people that he knew he ultimately was trying to kill. Oh my god, this show's so good.
Yeah. Because I mean, you're right. You can see Reiner broken, and
Yeah.
when Eren meets up with him in the fourth season in that little underground room kind
Mhm.
of thing, I mean, you could tell like how broken he is. Like Falco is like, what's going on? Like what is going on? Like he could not understand what was happening. And like you can just see Reiner broken, and Aaron's like, I mean, payback. This is
Yeah.
vengeance. And it's like you're like you said, like, is this what it feels like? And it's just, I think you're right. Like sometimes people do bad things because they're told to do so,
Mhm.
and they don't question it because the group they're part of, whatever it may be, like they're the right group, or they're the
Yeah.
right group or whatever. They believe it's the right group, and like what is done in the name of like justice and freedom and all this other stuff sometimes isn't the greatest thing ever. And sometimes it's hard to like talk about that in the real world because then you're talking about, oh, you're talking about my country, you're talking about my group. um
Yeah.
that's what I mean, this show is so good for many different reasons, but one of them specifically that I like is that we can talk about this without having to single any individual specific real life group and still talk about
Yeah, because it's not about any specific real life group. And I think that's an important thing to realize. Like it uses
differentiate.
it uses imagery to make you think, oh, this kind of reminds me of, Nazi Germany or internment camps. But there's so much actual stuff going on that in the show that's like it doesn't map on perfectly to any of these real life dynamics. It's just like a sort of a conglomerate of like the terrors of the cycle of war and violence and racism. And it is using, certain stuff to make you feel a certain way about it. But it's not trying to tell a story about a real life conflict that's happening and who's on the right side of either one of those conflicts. Like it's not, because it is not about one particular thing. Um, did you ever take the psychology class at the Lone Star Honors College?
Yes, with Professor Jelen Lewis.
Yeah, yeah. Do
Yep.
you remember the Milgram experiment where
Yes.
Oh, dude, I think that's so interesting because you brought up like people just doing what they were told because they were told by someone with like
Yeah.
who's part of their group. I think the Milgram experiments, like, I don't know how well received. I wonder if there's like big criticisms of the Milgram experiment, but like even just hearing about it, that something like the original experiment was like 70% of people would have gone on to deliver like a fatal blow just because
I
they were
think it was
told to by a
more.
doctor.
Yeah, I want to say it was more. I think it was more like 80%. Like it was this crazy arbitrary number that you would like 70, 80% is a lot thinking
Yeah.
about like the general public. And like most people would say, I would never do that. I would, like I have more compassion, I have more empathy, I have more whatever that
Yeah,
I
like
would
I would be
never
able to stand
just
up for.
but it's easy to see how quickly we can be like influenced. I hate to, I would, yeah, I'm not gonna say that word, but like influence or like subjected um to doing these things, and how easy it is just because like someone in a lab coat told you to do so.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, it's okay because you're told this person deserves it. This is like an acceptable punishment. But it's like, okay, what is an acceptable punishment? Like, yeah, the Milgram experiment is, I can think about and talk about it for probably hours in and of itself, just because like I like playing with that thought and playing with like how would I react to it, like knowing about it now, would that still change the way I would
Mhm.
perhaps perform in the experiment. um, but I mean, yeah, I could talk for hours on that. But before we start running in circles, do you have any final thoughts?
Um, I don't know. I think generally the way I like to perceive media is, or like consume media, is just on its own merit with me. Like the most important thing to me when, and I mean, this sounds fairly obvious, but people don't think about it that much. But like the most important thing to me when I'm watching a show or reading a book or watching a movie is the experience that I'm having with that piece of media.
Mhm.
So I don't really care like what the author wanted or what the creator wanted for that. Like I think bad people can make good things. I mean, let's be real. Most people, all people are very flawed. Most people
Yeah.
at one point in time are going to be a bad person in someone's eyes.
Mhm.
So every painting you've ever liked, every movie you've ever liked, every song you've ever listened to that you've enjoyed was made by someone who at one point was like a bad person. So I don't, that doesn't really concern me. Like if, and the, I don't know how much of this is credible, but there are claims out there about the author of Attack on Titan being like not a good guy. But it's like, to me, that that doesn't matter with my experience with the series. Like if I can, I think, okay, so this is complicated.
Yeah,
So I think you can, a bad person can make something that can be interpreted in good ways. Not because you can make, like, art is independent. I think art is an experience between the consumer and the piece.
hmm
But you can have people who perpetuate harmful things in their media, either intentionally or unintentionally, and it can still be harmful. So one popular criticism that I've heard recently of Harry Potter is that J.K. Rowling wrote the bankers at one point and described them as like small, like hook-nosed people. And hook-nosed is a popular like stereotype caricature of Jewish people. And so I don't know for sure. I don't know that J.K. Rowling is like an anti-Semitic person, but she might have, thought, oh, small greedy bankers. What does that look like in my mind? And then what comes to her mind is a Jewish stereotype. I don't know that she knew that was a Jewish stereotype, but the fact that it's in the work is like, okay, we can recognize that as harmful, I think. Um, her intention doesn't matter there. Either she's anti-Semitic or she's not. I don't really care. What I can see is like, oh, this is a harmful representation of, a caricature of a stereotype, and I think that shouldn't, like, that's a bad thing. But other than, so you can use, like, when you're consuming a piece of media, you can be critical of it, but the author's intent like almost doesn't even matter at all.
Yeah.
And so I think what we should, I think the way most people should engage with media is like, experience it for yourself, develop your own opinions on it, and then like go from there. And you can discuss with people how you feel about certain things, but I think it's like the principal thing I'm concerned with at all times is like, okay, how is my experience with this piece of media? And so I think if you read some criticism of something and you're like, oh, that sounds valid, but I'm like still interested, like give it a shot.
Yeah.
I think Attack on Titan's really good. I think you should, like, people should watch it. And if, I mean, it's very violent. There's lots of sensitive material in there. And if that's not your thing, that's not your thing. But I think you should not write it off because someone told you that it has like, imagery of fascist governments, and because of that, it's like a pro-fascist show. I don't think it is. I think, and I mean, that's my claim. If you watch it and you have a different claim, I think that's fair, and we could discuss that maybe. But I think everyone should at the very least give it a shot.
I agree. And so kind of like to build off of what you were saying, to add a final note would be work and author can be like different. We can make work independent from what the author, who the author is in
Yeah.
certain cases. And so yeah, I mean, I agree, like maybe this show isn't for everyone just because of how like graphic and violent it can be at times, but I would always recommend it. And I agree, just because of the imagery that's there. I think it's more thought-provoking than anything, than trying to actually like pinpoint something. Like, yeah, like you said, it's a conglomerate of different
Mhm.
imagery from different points in time, that can be very reminiscent of things that have happened in our real life history,
Yeah.
but they're more there to like kind of get us to think about it. And when we can, I guess, look beyond just the simple, oh, you know what, that's Nazi Germany because this and this, but
Mhm.
and actually think, okay, well, no, these are like more Nazi Germany traits, but like, why is it there? And like just question what we're watching and kind of use that to help expand our experience and like try to understand different, like, because there is a narrative there, but there's like a lot of sub things that are there, and there's a lot of like you said, imagery, and there's a lot of little things that are going on too. I think if we look deeper into it, we can get a lot from this show. I mean, we've talked for over 30 minutes about it now, and we could, talk for hours about this and like bring someone else into the mix that also watches it, and they might not even get what we were talking about. They might get something that's also valid, and we could spend another couple hours talking about that.
Yeah.
I think my final note, like you said, is um, things can be independent. It just depends on the experience you take from it. And you're right, like that kind of sounds obvious, but at the same time, like I think that gets brushed off. Like sometimes we go watch the new Avengers movie because it's the new hype thing,
Mhm.
and like we want to watch it, but like what kind of experience did you actually have? Like that's a valid, and I think a really interesting question to look at. Thad, thank you for coming on. I should mention that he is interpersonal communications major, so this is like right up his alley. And I just love watching things and thinking about the world. I'm actually a communications minor, but I mean that's a whole different thing, right? So thank you for coming on. I would love to have you on. Maybe we can talk about Death Note next. That would be awesome. Or I mean any other anime or
Ooh, actually, I'm gonna throw you a recommendation, unless you're watching something right now.
no, go for it. Go for it.
Okay, so have you heard of Code Geass?
I believe so. I believe so. Just faintly though.
So I'm not gonna like spoil everything for you, but it's another very like anti-war, anti-racism, anti-classism show, and it's
Okay.
like it came out in like 2006, I think, and it gets compared a lot to Death Note because of its main character. They're similar in certain ways. I don't think Light is a good guy, but
Yeah.
they have similar, like, I guess, like personalities kind of. But the way I would describe Code Geass is like Death Note meets Attack on Titan, and I think
Okay.
I think it's one of 5 shows that I've ever given like a 10 out of 10. No, no, no.
Wow. Okay.
One of 3 shows that I've ever like given a 10 out of 10. It's like tied for my number 1 spot in a 3-way tie.
Oh, okay.
I think
So,
I would recommend that show, especially if you like Attack on Titan. If you're stuck waiting a year for the next part of the show and you're not going to read the manga, you should watch Code Geass.
okay, I will. So what we can do is talk about Death Note next, and then we can talk about that one,
Yeah.
and maybe when we talk about that one, we can talk about how it relates to the other things we have watched. I think
But you just reminded me,
very
I made
interesting.
like a tweet or something about it, and then someone who's a very like vehement like Attack on Titan fan, because I prefer Code Geass to Attack on Titan personally, and I made a tweet like that, and someone responded, like searched on Twitter like the main character of Code Geass to find my tweet, and then was like, actually he sucks, and I was like, please leave me alone.
Yes.
That's my opinion.
Right. And sometimes, I mean, that's our opinions are just that. And I mean, because they're the reception of our experience and they're the interpretation of our experience. And
Yeah.
we experience things differently. And yeah, I like that. I will definitely watch that. I'm not watching anything right now. Just got done with school and everything, and I'm trying to.
Feels so good to be out for the
Yeah.
summer and to not have homework.
Yeah, I should have taken a summer class, but anyways, thank you guys for watching. If you have seen Attack on Titan or want to think about watching it, we just ruined it for you. But or maybe not because we didn't reveal a lot of stuff. But right, but thank you for watching, and we'll be in touch soon.
Yeah.